Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
This will be the 7th episode in a mini-series focused on answering a fundamental question in the deconstruction and reconstruction of the version of Christianity I grew up with. After sifting through a long list of theological tenets and rejecting a substantial number of them, what do I still believe about Jesus Christ? Much of that deconstruction was a result of losing confidence in the Bible, losing an absolute commitment to the idea that the Bible is a completely divine book, completely without error, undiluted by human distortion. The very first book of the Bible to shatter that conviction was the book of Genesis, with its account of the six-day creation story, and then a second apparent retelling of the creation of humans. Breaking the cognitive hold that book had on my worldview began a journey of sifting through my beliefs. One outcome of that introspective journey is that each of the other books of the Bible has gone through a renovation in my mind now. I once took them all literally. I now read them all completely differently. But the three books that have undergone the greatest transformation in my mind, the greatest reassessment, maybe I should even use the word downgrade, would be Genesis, and then Revelation, and then John's Gospel account.
Yeah, it's interesting that you picked those books because I've had a similar experience to the exclusion, I guess, maybe of John's Gospel. But yeah, Revelation and Genesis were two works that my views went through quite radical changes in regard, particularly, especially Genesis. But it's kind of interesting that, unlike you maybe, they kind of went up in my estimation in a sense, not in the traditional sense, not in the way that they're viewed by conservatives, but once I started to look at them in new ways, I found them even more fascinating. I guess
Right.
let's put it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Decades ago, when I was a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, the Gospel of John was for me one of the most powerfully inspirational books of the biblical canon. It portrayed Jesus as the Logos, something I didn't understand at all at that time, but it sounded cool, sounded important, and made Jesus look like bigger than real life. That image of a Logos, again, whatever that meant, it certainly reinforced the image of Christ that I got from the Apostle Paul, the image of a cosmic deity, disembodied, a blazing light. All of those I am statements that made Jesus into something superhuman, like I am the light of the world, I'm the Alpha and Omega, I'm the resurrection and the life, before Abraham was, I am, and many other similar statements. And for some reason, those big claims from Christ himself just don't appear in the other three gospel accounts. Instead, the other three, portray a more human kind of Jesus that I could better relate to. But once I began to question the Bible in general, and the book of John in particular, I started to notice more and more things about the book of John that created distance between me and the person I was trying to understand. Which is unfortunate because you'd think a gospel account, written by someone who I thought actually walked and talked with Jesus himself, you'd think that would be a great resource for trying to develop my Christology.
It's interesting. There's one sense, as I've been thinking about your comments and this our discussions, is that in one weird way, you could almost say that the Gospel of John is the only gospel. Now, what do I mean by that?
Wow.
What I mean by that is that the synoptics, what we call the synoptics because of all their parallels, they do tend to, whether we always agree or whether, they conflate things, and they maybe some of the miraculous things are additions and all that kind of stuff, but they try to come across as giving us some sense of the historical reality, right? The things that Jesus did, right? The sequence of his ministry and things like that. Whereas John's gospel completely dispenses with that, pretty much. His gospel is all about the message. And he makes this very clear. He makes this clear in his prologue. He makes this clear at the end of the gospel, right? Where he explicitly says, I'm writing this stuff to convince you of something, to convince you that this man, Jesus, is the cosmic Christ, is the savior of the world and so on. So he's very explicit. The author there, he's very explicit about what he's doing, that he's interpreting this man's life and ministry along very theological lines. So in one sense, there's an honesty there. He doesn't try to do it covertly. He's very upfront about that. But it is also true that puts it in a whole different category, which is why his gospel is seen as so different than the others. It does put it in a very different category from the other gospels. Not so much emphasis on a blow by blow historical record, but more a theological interpretation of a historical figure, more of a gospel than the other gospels in the sense of the gospel being a message, right? The gospel being a theological construct. He's very clear about that.
So you said that he was, I think you used the word sincere at one point, but he has an agenda. You made that clear. And so he's trying to make a point that this is a person that you want to believe. But now my beef is that he does that by making huge claims about this person, Jesus.
Right.
Things that the other three didn't make, and I wonder why they didn't make it, maybe because they didn't even think it at the time.
Right.
Making him bigger. And
yeah, so it kind of comes down to what you believe. If you're kind of a critical historian, you're going to look at that and say, well, this guy is obviously enhancing things to make his case. He's adding things that we don't see from other traditions. I get that from a historical critical perspective. That totally makes sense. If you're a believer, you would just say, well, that's how God inspired him to write this gospel and his interpretation. And so that's how we should take it. So I can see kind of both sides of that argument.
I mean, the best example, comparing Jesus to the Logos.
Right.
Maybe we should first explain what is this Logos. I understand there's a Greek understanding of that word, how it was meant by a Greek writer, and how it would also be meant or taken by a Hebrew writer or a Hebrew audience.
Right. So this is a very rich discussion, the idea of Logos. And of course, John's prologue has generated literally hundreds of volumes of scholarly work to try to understand what's going on there. It's a rich term, and it's very much in the Hellenistic culture. So it's a pretty well-known concept within the Hellenistic world, which was the world of this writer. And it appears not just in the Greek literature, but also in the Jewish literature. So, for example, Philo, the most important Greek Jewish thinker of that time, talks about the Logos. And he compares the Logos to the Jewish concept of things like wisdom and understanding and so on. And he adopts it in that sense. So there seems to be, because it was such a widespread concept within Hellenism, it would seem to me that religious thinkers then baptize the term with their own understanding, which is what we see in Philo doing. And I think we see John doing that here, that he's doing this similar kind of thing. He's saying this Logos is actually Jesus.
But before we get that far, Scott, let's just say, what would a true dyed-in-the-wool Greek person, especially a Greek philosopher, what would they mean by the word the Logos?
Well, I quote pagan Greek, not a Jewish Greek. Yeah, they would see the Logos as reason, probably, maybe wisdom. I mean, it's a Platonic term, it comes goes back to the Greek philosophers.
And it's very much impersonal. It's not a person, it's a force, it's a quality.
Right.
I'm at a loss for words, but it's not a person.
No.
It's meant to capture the logic of the universe, the laws of the universe.
Right.
So that's the Greek, but now you made some references to Jews who are Greek or Greeks who are Jews. What would a Jew, a pure dyed-in-the-wool Jew mean? They wouldn't use the word the Logos. You might know what word they use in Hebrew, but what were they getting at? What were they thinking when they heard some Greek guy talking about the Logos?
The Jewish understanding would have revolved around the idea of word and wisdom. So you do have this thread in the Old Testament of the word being something active and not just passive.
Right. So the idea of the word of Yahweh creating the universe, creating everything by just speaking it into existence.
Right. So there's a creation concept in there. In the Wisdom of Solomon, it talks about God's word being all powerful, God's word not coming back void. So there's lots of references to the word in the Old Testament, and they would tend to link that with this word in Greek, which means word. Logos does literally mean word.
So whoever was the writer of the Gospel of John, using this imagery of the Logos, writing to people who are either Jews or Greek or both, what he's doing there is he's taking this impersonal thing, the Logos, the impersonal force, the rationale of the universe, or the word of God, which created the universe, created the world.
Right.
And then saying, this thing, this impersonal force that created everything and that underlies the whole universe, It was a guy, and he lived with us. He lived
Right,
among us, and it
right.
just blows the mind of the hearers at that time when they read that for the first time. They just, I'm sure their minds almost literally
Oh
blew.
yeah, oh yeah. I mean,
So, go
yeah,
ahead.
this is the in a sense maybe you could say the scandal of the prologue in a sense that in the beginning was God. Okay, everybody can accept that. You hear a Jew listening to that and thinking, okay, in the beginning was God. You hear a Greek might be thinking, yeah, okay, in the beginning was God. And God was, and then all of a sudden, this Logos. Well, guess what? That's Jesus.
Right.
And so that's the twist. That's the
Yeah.
surprise. And you're right, that would have been very shocking.
Yeah. Now, I think there's a third understanding of this logos. We talked about the pure Jew and the pure Greek having very different understandings and in the first century. Now you've got the 21st century Westerner who
Mm.
reads this, the 21st century evangelical. I think a lot of people, when they read that prologue, which is what we mean by the first chapter of John, they read that and they think, okay, Jesus was the Logos, the Word. He was the message. So he
Mm.
brought God's message to us, the Word in that sense. And there may be something there, but I find that to be kind of watering down the power of this imagery,
It
right?
might, yeah, it probably doesn't get at the richness of it.
No, exactly.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's where unfortunately translations have to be often explained.
Right.
If you just read them face value, you're reading them from your cultural viewpoint, and you're not going to get a lot of that nuance and so on that if you had been a first century Greek, you might have picked up automatically,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's bring in our guest, our scholar, our expert on this book of John and see what he has to say. I wanted to do this mini-series, talk to scholars about divine inspiration, about the writing of the New Testament, particularly the gospel accounts, about the gospel writers themselves and what inspired them and the resources they used to put their stories together, including Greco-Roman literature we learned from Robin Walsh 2 weeks ago, and then the whole art of myth-making we heard from Louis Marcos. I now want to do an episode that focused exclusively on the Gospel of John. And in doing some of my background research, I found the perfect scholar to consult on this very subject. Dr. Mark Goodacre completed his entire undergrad and graduate training at Oxford University and is currently the Francis Hill Fox Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. He's widely published with 8 books and innumerable scholarly papers and articles, editorials, and review papers. His most recently published book focuses squarely on the Gospel of John, so he's clearly the best expert we could get on this thorny question of why should I use the Gospel of John to learn anything about Jesus of Nazareth? Dr. Goodacre, Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Luke, and thanks, Scott. Great pleasure to be here.
Welcome.
Now, Mark, I've heard, we've done a little bit of homework, and I've heard that you've got the reputation as being quite the contrarian.
I try not to. I mean, I don't really entirely know where it comes from. It may be because maybe in life in general, I have quite a sunny disposition. So perhaps I try and find ways of being contrarian through my scholarship. Maybe it's that. I don't know.
Yeah,
Well,
any scholar who would take on the idea of Q is pretty brave, I think.
Either brave or foolhardy, one of the two.
Well, longtime listeners of the podcast are going to say, and I can be quite the contrarian as well. It's been the heart of the podcast. And what's going to make this even more fun is that you're quite the champion of the Gospel of John, while I've developed a very serious allergy against the Gospel of John. So this is going to be fun.
Well, there's aspects of John's Gospel that are profoundly troubling. I suppose in my book, I don't embrace lots of the really troubling areas because I've got the one thesis that I'm really pushing. So I will be with you part way on things that,
Good.
cause us to, think hard about what's going on in John.
Okay. Now, before we get into the deep end of the pool, let's get to know you a little bit better. One major focus, and perhaps the major focus of your work, is the writing of the New Testament, particularly the Gospel accounts. Your first 2 books tackled what scholars call the synoptic problem. So there was the first book, The Synoptic Problem, A Way Through the Maze, that came out in 2001. And then a year later, The Case Against Q, Studies in Mark and Priority, and the Synoptic Problem. So maybe we should start with a quick 101 to what is this thing called the synoptic problem?
Yeah, I've always been absolutely fascinated with the synoptic problem, which is the question of how Matthew, Mark, and Luke relate. And it's really a pretty simple problem to state. There is so much agreement between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so much disagreement. The synoptic problem is puzzling out, why do they agree so much? Why do they disagree so much? And to me, it's just one of those enigmas that demands a solution. And I love, searching for those solutions.
Okay. And we're going to see a lot of those similarities and differences. And maybe we could just spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about the writing of the first 3 Gospels, just partly to give us some background, but also I want to juxtapose the writing of those 3 and the content of those 3 against the same for John. So the common understanding amongst scholars for at least a century, if not 2, was that those 3 books drew from an oral tradition, which some scholars more recently referred to as Q, and Mark was written 2 or 3 decades after the events it describes, while Matthew and Luke, they come out a few decades after Mark. But you and many scholars push back on a lot of this, and I think you push back on the whole idea of an oral tradition and on Q, and you push back the writing of all 3 books several decades further yet. So maybe unpack both of those points, the oral tradition and Q, and the dating of the writing of the first 3 Gospels.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't push back on all those things, but you're right, I do push back on some of them. So the thing that I agree with most scholars on is that Mark was the first gospel to have been written. I'm a very strong believer in the priority of Mark. In other words, Matthew and Luke both use Mark's gospel. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But the thing about the synoptic gospels is you've got this whole bunch of material that is in Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark. And some of it is really, really similar, like in wording, really similar. And so that has to come from somewhere. And for me, the most plausible place for that to have come from is Luke has directly got it out of Matthew's gospel. So in other words, as well as knowing Mark, Luke knows Matthew. Now, if that's true, then we don't need Q, because Q is the thing that is hypothesized to explain that non-Markan material that you find in Matthew and Luke. And on oral tradition, it can't be down to oral tradition, at least in total, it can't be down to oral tradition, because the literary similarities are just so great. You get Matthew and Luke agreeing for whole sentences at a time in a way that you can do tests on oral tradition. You can do tests on what people remember. People don't quote verbatim entire paragraphs unless they've learnt it from a text. And, here we've got, a text. So my solution is fairly simple. I think that Mark's the first gospel used by both Matthew and Luke, but that Luke also had access to Matthew's gospel.
So the concept that I've heard over the years, I guess, and even in my earlier training, was that the reason for that exact match is because maybe these were liturgical sayings, or these were memorized things, and therefore it's maybe not as outlandish that they're so precise. But obviously you don't agree.
No, because when the fascinating thing about appealing to liturgy is that usually when you get liturgical sayings, you get more variation, not less. You think about it today. If you walk into a Presbyterian church in the US, they will say, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors."
As opposed to other Protestant churches like Anglican, Methodist, and Lutherans, who will say, "Forgive our trespasses."
If you walk into a Catholic church, they won't have "For thine be the glory, the power, and the kingdom." Well, actually, some Catholic liturgies now do have that, but you know what I mean? So liturgies vary hugely. And some of the stuff where Matthew and Luke agree really closely in that double tradition material, it's over things like just sayings that Jesus is going on about, like when he's talking about a sign of Jonah for this generation. No sign would be given except the sign of Jonah. And then we just get these whole paragraph almost the same. And it's not just Jesus' sayings, it's John the Baptist's sayings, it's even the centurion. When Jesus heals the centurion's sayings are almost verbatim in Matthew and Luke. So I think the liturgical explanation it doesn't cut it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And Mark, again, did you comment on the dating of Mark and then Matthew and Luke?
No, I didn't, although I'm happy to do so. Broadly speaking, I think that Mark is written probably post-70, after the destruction of Jerusalem. I think fairly soon after the destruction of Jerusalem. I think that because Matthew knew Mark, I want to place Matthew after that. For the sake of argument, let's say 80. Luke, I think I want to push into the late first, early second century for a range of reasons, one of which is that I think he shows knowledge of the Jewish historian Josephus, who's writing in the mid-90s. So that's broadly where I go. If you want a kind of rule of thumb, I think Mark 70, Matthew 80, Luke 90 to 100, maybe even 110, something like that.
Right. I remember growing up with the idea that Mark had to have been written before the destruction of Jerusalem because of the whole Jewish war, because there's no mention whatsoever of it, but you've got it after the fact. You want to explain why that's the change of thinking there?
I used to think the same thing, but the thing is, Mark's gospel is obsessed with the temple. It's absolutely obsessed with the temple. Like, you get the temple cleansing story in Mark 11, and from there all the way through to the end of the gospel, you keep getting the temple mentioned over and over again, and in several contexts where its destruction is actually literally mentioned. So in Mark 13, there's a whole bunch of stuff talking about the destruction of the temple. One of the guys that mocks Jesus on the cross, he says, "You who would destroy the temple and raise it in 3 days, bring yourself down from the cross." So those sorts of prophecies really make sense if the readers are thinking, oh my goodness, like Jesus was prophesying the destruction of the temple, and it's happened. It's all about showing that your prophet is successful. Because if your prophet has prophesied something successfully, you're after that event and going, oh my goodness, we should have seen the signs. You read Josephus, the Jewish historian, that's what he does. He has people prophesying the end. The reader can see the end coming, but the characters in the drama aren't seeing it. So that's why I think Mark makes better sense. I can't prove that it's post-70, but I think it makes better sense if you read it in a post-70 context.
I really like that explanation. I heard you give that one time on another podcast, because I've struggled with that, and I've often had similar thoughts. And the idea that I think at one point you said, it wouldn't be mentioned at all if it hadn't happened.
Right.
And I think that's a really excellent point. I never thought of it that way before. But why would they talk about a prophecy that didn't come true, right?
No, right. You are such a hostage to fortune if you start writing literary works that really place emphasis on the success of your character as a prophet, if you know that the prophecy hasn't been fulfilled yet, because you as an author could look like a real fool if it doesn't come about,
Yes, yeah, no.
Okay, so let's now talk about the writing of the Gospel of John, and for that matter, the writing of your book, Mark. You've written this recent book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, John's Knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Sorry, we don't have video, so they can't see it. This book is actually the reason why we invited you onto the podcast, because we're working on a series of episodes that drill in specifically into the question of who is Jesus, at least where we've landed on that. And we're leaning on the Gospels and Paul's writings to answer that question. Because I had thought it was a good strategy to get our information from people who were closest to the story, people we had thought were actual eyewitnesses. But that idea, those ideas are quickly dissolving as we do this deep dive. So would you then give us your elevator pitch for this latest book of yours? Again, the Fourth Synoptic Gospel, John's Knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for most of history, people have assumed that John's Gospel knew and used the Synoptic Gospels, and that was writing in some sense a supplementary book. But really, from the middle of the 20th century onwards, a lot of scholars said, hold on, we think this book is just too different. It must be independent of the Synoptics. And I think that is wrong. And I think that you make much better sense of John's Gospel if it is not only writing with knowledge of the synoptics, but using them, trying to transform things in them, trying to make explicit what they have as implicit. And all in all, just writing something which is literally meant to be like a fourth gospel that you read after you've read the other three. So I argue effectively, I try and argue that if you look carefully at the agreements between the synoptics and John, it becomes really implausible the more you stare at them to think that John is writing in ignorance of the synoptic gospels. That's basically the pitch.
Okay. And who exactly wrote this? I mean, there's several Johns, and there's some people who even talk about the Johannine community. And when was it written?
In a sense, that's the hardest thing, because, the work doesn't stamp its author's name and date on it, unlike, our works, where you can tell exactly when we wrote it and how. So, that's a little difficult. And the author is kind of coy about his identity. He does want to say that this work is derived from an eyewitness. So he has this character, the beloved disciple, who crops up explicitly for the first time in John 13, and then you keep seeing him all the way through to John 21. And there's a claim that he is the kind of source of much of the material there. So that's who it's kind of linking itself with. There's then the sort of separate question, though, of whether that actually is the author of the work. And on that one, I'm more on the kind of skeptical side. I think that he's making an authorial claim, but actually the author is probably someone in the late first, early second century who is kind of representing himself as being present there, but actually wasn't.
Okay, and what about this idea of the Johannine community?
Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of the Johannine community. I mean, the author's not writing in a vacuum. The author clearly has his community. We all have our own communities, whether it's, the community of your podcast listeners, whether it's, for me, it's the classroom at Duke, whether it's my colleagues at Duke, whether it's the colleagues at conferences. We all have those kind of interlocking communities. And I don't doubt that the author of the fourth gospel had a community in those senses. But I am very wary of the idea that we can trace the history of the community from reading the pages of John's Gospel, as if John's Gospel is like an allegory of the Johannine community. I don't think that's the case. I think it's fundamentally trying to tell the story of Jesus, not the story of the Johannine community. So I'm one of those that resists the idea of the Johannine community.
What about that? Sorry. I'm just curious. I agree with what you're saying, but what about situations like with Thomas, for example, when he makes the editorial comment that, well, he puts it in, I believe, in Jesus' mouth, but you've seen and believed. Blessed are those who haven't seen. That seems to me to be he's kind of preaching to someone, because he talks a lot about being an eyewitness and stuff like that. So somehow out there, you think there was the kind of the concept that, well, how can you believe these things because nobody really saw them? And he's kind of making a point that, even better if you believe these things that you didn't see firsthand, because that even takes more faith in a sense, which
right.
Does,
no, right. Yeah, no, absolutely. If you think about it, it's a pretty profound thing that the author's saying there. He's really saying that the number of people who actually got to witness the historical Jesus, the Jesus of Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth, is absolutely the tiniest proportion of people who will ever live on this earth. And so it's the most amazing way at the end of the gospel that it points outward to everybody else, all of those readers, not just in the world at the time, but in the generations that come afterwards. I think it's a really profound way to end a gospel. It's a little bit like at the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus says that, he says, behold, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. So you get this kind of spatial thing, I'll be with you, but then this chronological thing, I'll be with you to the end of the age. And I think John's gospel is a little like that right at the end, it suddenly becomes really aware of its position as a sacred text that people are going to read and think seriously about. So it's actually quite a profound statement you've got there at the end of John there, I think.
Is it almost an apologia?
Yeah, I think there's an aspect of that. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely, yeah.
And of course, the writers that follow the apostles, some of them, are apologists, right? Like that seems to be one of the first, one of the first types of literature that we see coming in the Christian world is apologias.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump into the heart here. This whole idea of John being the title of your own book is John's Gospel is synoptic. It's the fourth synoptic. And I'm one of those people who does see the Gospel of John as being so very different. So maybe let's start with the definition of the word synoptic, especially how you mean the word.
Yeah, well, maybe I should start off with a sort of slight apologia of my own, which is that I wanted to call the book Fourth Gospel without the, because I wanted to stress that it's fourth and that you might read the book in the light of the Synoptic Gospels. And I had a whole last chapter which was just called Fourth Gospel, which you reflected on what it means to read it as fourth. But my second chapter was called The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, and it specifically went after places where John is synoptic, because there are several passages where John is synoptic. Now, the thing is, it was a hostage to fortune because my publisher really liked that title. And so they said, okay, we love the book, we want to publish, but we want to suggest a name change. We want to call the book The Fourth Synoptic Gospel following your chapter 2. And I resisted it at first, but I thought, well, do you know what? I've got plausible deniability. I can say, hey, it's not my fault. It was my publisher. And there's something kind of joyous about getting to the stage of my career where I can blame my publisher for things. And to be clear, my publisher, Erdmann's, are wonderful, but So that's my little sort of apology for it. But I will stand by it insofar as there's a technical sense in which John is very clearly synoptic. And this is that why are the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, called synoptic? They're called synoptic because you can put them side by side in a gospel synopsis book. Matthew, Mark, Luke in columns. And the fact is, and it really is a fact, you can put John's gospel alongside the synoptics frequently. Not all the time. You try and put the blind man from John 9 alongside the synoptics and there's not a lot to go on. You try and put the Samaritan woman from John 4 alongside the synoptics, you're going to struggle with that. But when you get to scenes like the anointing in John 12 or the arrest in John 18, or even the feeding of the 5,000 or the healing of the official son or John the Baptist preaching, you can frequently get this synopsis alongside the others. So I thought to myself, it actually technically is a synoptic gospel, even if we have to acknowledge very strongly that it is very different. That is important. And I'm not saying that John is to Luke as Luke is to Matthew as Matthew is to Mark. I think there's a significant journey that you have to walk on between Luke and John. And the journey is much shorter to get from Matthew to Luke and to get from Mark to Matthew.
Right. So could we put a really fine point then on this difference between them? I mean, despite your plausible deniability, I still want to push back on this idea of it being synoptic. So please indulge me. It'll take me a minute or two to get these ideas out.
Sure.
We've talked about how you've got three Gospels that are synoptic, and then this idea that maybe John is also synoptic. But I think there's two settings, two switches on the synopticometer. I don't know if you've got one of those gadgets at Duke University, but the synopticometer, the one setting, it zooms in on the specific details, and the other setting zooms out and looks at the broader perspective. And another way to say what I'm getting at here is you hold the synopticometer in one way to compare the scenery that the two authors are describing, but then you turn the meter around backwards, kind of like taking binoculars and flipping them over backwards to see what's going on in the head of the viewer looking at the scenery, and comparing the vision and the worldview of the two authors. And so they can be synoptic in the details that catch their eyes. I've heard you talking about how John will catch the same details as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So they can be synoptic in the details that catch their eyes, but they might turn those details into completely different representations of reality. So in that sense, they're just not synoptic. And let me be more specific here. Matthew and Luke both begin their biographies of Jesus with genealogies, which firmly root Jesus in the soil of first-century Palestine, and they're emphasizing Jesus' humanity and his humble origins. And we went through this in previous episodes. Everyone in the vignettes and anecdotes refer to Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, which is a very human thing. But John looks at the same set of details, and he begins his biography equating Jesus with, and even identifying Jesus with, the logos of the universe. And a lot of people, I didn't realize this as a younger believer, but we're telling our listeners, this logos was a logic, it was a rationale, a metaphysical principle, and it existed before the creation of the universe. So there's nothing in the other three Gospels that even come close to this claim that John is making, and it pushes Christology into a whole new territory. So this is what I mean when I say that John is not at all synoptic with those three.
Yeah, I mean, okay, clearly the Logos hymn at the beginning of John 1 is pretty striking. There's nothing exactly like that in the synoptics at all. Though, even there, I would say that when you look at some of the details in John's prologue, they do actually reflect things that you see in the synoptics. You take the most famous verse there, 1:14, and the word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory. Well, do the disciples ever behold Jesus' glory? Yeah. The transfiguration story, Peter, James, and John want to build tabernacles for Jesus. And what happens is they see in Luke's gospel his glory. So even in John's most cosmologically, over the top Christological statements, you see these links with the synoptics. But I would want to throw in as well that sometimes we're so dazzled by that logos, that word made flesh, hymn, poem, whatever you want to call it at the beginning of John, that we miss that the most important thing in John's Christology actually isn't the logos after all. The thing he really wants to underline is that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And I tell you how I know that. Because in John 20, verses 30 and 31, he says, there are many other things that he could have written about, many of the signs that he could have written about. But these ones, he says, I've written about in order that you may know that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing in him, you might have life in his name. So when we get to the thing that he really wants to underline at the end of the gospel, what is it? Messiah and Son of God, which is about as synoptic a Christology as you can get. In fact, in Matthew's gospel, it's Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That is what Peter says at Caesarea Philippi. So yeah, all of that accepted, that John's Christology, is kind of sky high. I mean, it really is a high Christology, but he still remains somehow rooted in this synoptic Christology. And it's not just synoptic Christology. Paul, our earliest witness, sees Jesus as Messiah and Son of God. So John hasn't, even though he's on a journey, he's not in the stratosphere. He's still stayed here on earth.
So one of the ideas that we've been toying with in this podcast in the past few episodes was the idea that all through Jesus' ministry, he always presented himself as the Messiah. He wanted people to see him as Messiah, and they treated him like a human who had the title Messiah. But then decades later, they look back on this figure and they begin to reconfigure, add some flourishes. I talked about some artistic flourishes on the portrait that was of a human, but now they're putting in little brushes here and there, little strokes to bring in this idea of divinity and this cosmic deity, the logos, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think one of the things that goes on in John is that I think he feels that this synoptic theology, the synoptic Christology is sometimes just too subtle. It's too subtle. It's too elusive. So, Jesus in the synoptics, he keeps saying, well, the kingdom of God's like this, the kingdom of God's like that, and the Son of Man's going to do this, and the Son of Man's going to do that. And in John's gospel, he retains some of that language, but I think he wants things much more explicit, which is why you not only have that logos Christology right at the beginning, but then you have this ego Christology, I am, all the way through John's gospel. And I think that is his way of underlining so many key synoptic ideas, but making it much more explicitly Jesus. Every single one of those I am sayings that you get in John's gospel has imagery that you find in the synoptics. Like light of the world is like that phrase is straight out of Matthew's gospel. Jesus is the good shepherd. Well, you can't think of anything more obviously Jesus-y than Jesus is the good shepherd, that goes looking for the lost sheep. And so you can go on, the true vine, the way, the truth, and the life. All of these, they are very, very synoptic ideas. It's just that they're more explicit in John's gospel.
Right. We're going to come back to those I am statements a little bit later. Scott, did you want to? I'm
just curious, as we're talking, I'm thinking, do you think there's any, now I know I'm not talking about dependence or knowledge of or anything like that of Paul, but is John in a sense similar to Paul in the sense that Paul is taking this man Jesus and the events around him and so on, and he, in a sense, in my mind at least, to some extent, he's reconfiguring Judaism around that. In other words, what does this mean for the Jewish people? What does it mean to be a Jew now? And so on. This to me is Paul's great dilemma and his project within a context of his time. Is John doing a similar thing where he's theologizing on these historical events, right? These are the things that happened, and this is what they mean. This is the theology behind them.
Yeah, I think so. And there are those links between Paul and John. I think where John has departed from Paul is the use of that term Judaios, Jew or Judean, where in John's gospel, usually when someone is called a Judaios, a Jew, it comes in a kind of hostile kind of setting. Not always, there's one or two exceptions, but frequently the Judai are those that are opposed to Jesus. So, and even people who are very clearly Jewish have problems with the Judai. One of the most amazing lines, I think, in the whole gospel is when Joseph of Arimathea is said to be a secret disciple of Jesus, but he's secret because of his fear of the Judaioi, the Jews, which is, now he's obviously Jewish, this guy. Obviously, it doesn't make sense if he's not. So clearly Judaioi doesn't mean all Jewish people.
No,
and I think there we actually have moved away from some of Paul's terminology. Now, also, we don't want to get into the weeds, I suppose, with Paul. But Paul is actually quite careful about how he uses different terminology, like when he says Israel, when he says Jewish. And Paul does love terminology more than anything, like in Christ. Like that's the stuff that he probably wants to say more than anything else. And actually, John isn't a million miles away from some of Paul's ideas of the idea of participating in Christ, abiding in Christ, that you get in the farewell discourses in John. It's not a long way from Paul. So I do see some continuity as well as discontinuity between Paul and John.
So if it's okay, I'd like to bring us back to what we were talking about a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, about all four Gospels being in agreement that Jesus was the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. And I said how that's because I think that's what he presented himself all through his ministry. He presented himself as the Jewish Messiah, not as the Logos or as a cosmic divine savior. But then decades later, these writers, these people can go back and add some flourishes to the portrait that they had. Now, I just want to give an example of this because I don't think at the time that he was alive on earth that they had this idea of him being this, anything like the Logos, anything like a divine cosmic being, a deity. Because you look at even his closest followers, we talked earlier about Peter, Martha, and Mary, they all rebuked Jesus. We talked about the story of Thomas saying, just let me touch the wounds on your physical body and then I'll know it's you. And then there's the one example that I think is a clincher, Judas Iscariot saying, okay, I'm going to walk right up to him and kiss him on the cheek, and he's the guy you put the handcuffs on. They're not interacting with a deity of cosmic dimensions who they think is God himself. They're engaging with another human that you can scold and manipulate and put handcuffs on.
Yeah, but I think that's right. But I think also John's Gospel is quite a clever revelatory text, in the sense that it wants the reader to be able to see that Jesus is more than just, a human Messiah, son of David, of the Jewish people. So you have this real two-stage drama in John's Gospel where people in the drama frequently misunderstand him, sometimes to a ludicrous degree. I mean, like the conversation with Nicodemus, and he says, Jesus says you need to be born from above, and Nicodemus is going, what, I need to go back into my mother's womb? I mean, ridiculous response. So, so you have this sort of phenomenon of ludicrous misunderstandings of Jesus, but the reader does know what Jesus is talking about because the reader knows the end of the story.
Right.
And so there is a two-level drama going on in John, and the reader understands the drama better than the characters within it because they know how it turns out, and because they know about and because they've read the prologue where in the beginning was the Word. So you have that as well.
Right.
Even in the Synoptics, Luke, this idea that this Jesus is kind of this human guy, human Messiah, and Jewish Messiah, and so on, and then later on, looking back, like what you stated, I don't really buy it because in the Synoptics themselves, there's constant confusion as to who this guy is.
Right.
Constant confusion. And they don't hide that fact.
No, and a lot of the time, they're inviting the readers to make the connection. So you think in Mark 2, the story of the paralyzed man, you get this line, no one can forgive sins but God alone. And the reader's thinking, duh, this is God here in your midst. And then in John 5, we have a really similar story. In fact, even has some words in common with Mark 2, about picking up your mat and walking. And there you get the same issue. The reason why they're annoyed with Jesus is because he has made himself equal with God. So actually, but I go back to what is subtle in the Synoptics is explicit in John. What are just hints in the Synoptics are made really manifest in John. But so those things are there. It's just that you have to dig a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. But to use your own words, Mark, a couple of minutes ago, you were saying how John states what his goal is here. He's trying to show people a new understanding of Jesus. But my point was, at the time when the events were happening, they weren't seeing Jesus as anything more than human because, again, Judas Iscariot saying, okay, we're going to put handcuffs on the guy. But decades later, then you've got John saying, okay, now we want to tell the story differently. We want to add these extra artistic flourishes that we talked about.
But in the Synoptics, though, like I said, there's constant confusion as to who this guy is and why is he doing the things that he's doing and why is he doing things that only God does. N.T. Wright brings this out quite a bit in his work, where it's not so much that Jesus ever said, "I'm God." He wouldn't say something like that. And when they say you're God, he kind of pushes back on that, right? In a sense. But it's that the things he is doing and the authority he's exercising are only things that God exercises and authority that God and this I think that does come out in the synoptics quite often. And creates this confusion, right? So to me, I like what you're saying, Mark. That John just amps that up. John just wants to make sure he wants to make sure you get the message, right? Like
that's
like
right.
Like how he ends his gospel. I've written these things. I haven't written them as a biography. I haven't written them as interesting history. I've written them so you'll believe. Right?
Yeah, it's propaganda. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, propaganda.
Yeah. That's why they're called Gospels, good news. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right. Do that. They don't.
I mean, I suppose the question that you're asking, Luke, as well from there is if we were lucky enough to have the time machine and could actually go and experience Jesus' ministry, would we be, the kind of like the thick disciples that don't know what's going on, or the leaders that were confused by him, or would we actually be able to see? And that's a just really difficult one to answer, because when you read the Gospels, it's so obvious who Jesus is. I mean, there's no doubt. Even Mark's Gospel, the very first line is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. So there's no question. There's not. We're going to examine who this guy is. Let's find out. Who is he? It's just like, no, straight off the bat.
But Christ just means Messiah, right?
Right.
Okay, I agree.
But I mean, but what does Messiah mean? I mean, Messiah means you're anointed. You're anointed by God. And what are you anointed by God to do? Well, in the Synoptics and John, he's anointed to do a whole bunch of things, including dying and rising. I mean, that's sort of part of the mission. Or you look at Luke 4, where he quotes that line from Isaiah 61, where you have the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me. That's explicitly drawing attention to Jesus as Messiah in order to preach good news to the poor. So there is a claim of something, special identity there. Oh, right. Okay. It's not, absolutely, right. It's not the divine logos. 100% agree with that. But it is still some very, very special representative of God that is commissioned to do something really significant.
Okay. So let me take your own words again, Mark. Sorry. To make the next point, I want to come to something else now. Just a minute ago, you said something like the dying and the rising was at the heart of Jesus' mission. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was this whole raising of Lazarus from the dead. And I'm curious why. So you've got all the miracles recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I think there's 40 of them. And John captures 2 of them, adds 5 more. I'm not so much concerned about the fact that each of the different 4 gospel writers have some similar miracles and some different. That makes sense. A lot of things happened and they pick and choose. I get that. That's not a problem. What really is a problem, though, is the fact that neither Matthew, Mark, or Luke don't say anything about this rising of Lazarus from the dead.
Right.
And then the sermon that followed, Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life.
Yeah.
So again, I want to emphasize, I'm not pointing at the fact that John does have it. I'm just curious, if it did happen, why would Matthew, Mark, and Luke not refer to something like that? Because as you just said a minute ago, that was the heart of his mission, conquering death. And yet Matthew, Mark, and Luke scratched their heads and went, don't remember that. Or did John make it up?
Right. Well, I mean, my guess is, yeah, I think he did make it up. And when we're talking about it being at the heart of Jesus' mission, I'm thinking about that from the perspective of the gospel writers and the earliest Christians. I mean, it's another fascinating question, what the historical Jesus conceptualized his mission. But I mean, I think the easiest inference when it comes to John 11, the Lazarus story, is that the synoptic writers had never heard of it before. In fact, if you look at the way that John introduces the character of Lazarus, he says, well, there was this guy, certain guy. It's in Greek, it's tis, like a certain one, somebody, some guy. It's a really strange way to introduce a story if everybody knows who this is. Like, how come these people have never heard of him before? And that's the way that John's gospel generally introduces characters that we've not heard of before. When he introduces characters we've heard of, like Simon Peter, he just says, oh, Simon, he was, and then Andrew, Philip, he just throws these names in. He only makes a big deal about people if they're people who aren't in the synoptics, and then he'll go, well, there was this certain character, and now I'm going to tell you about this person. So it's partly what I mean about John is sometimes self-consciously trying to add to the synoptics. But I mean, if there was a story circulating that was like the raising of Lazarus, it would be a surprise if the synoptics hadn't got hold of it.
Exactly. Anything from you, Scott, there?
No, I don't think that changes anything really. It's just that may be ahistorical,
You say it may be historical or may not be?
No, may be ahistorical, not historical.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, from an evidentiary point of view, it seems very likely that for all the reasons that you both stated, that,
right.
And John's using it obviously as a platform. It's not about Lazarus being raised as much as it is about the coming of the kingdom and the resurrection and the life. These things that John wants to say that he can then weave into that story, right?
Right.
So I wasn't going to ask this, but now it just pops in my head then. So we've talked about many scholarly things about Q and about using accounts, passing them on, all of these scholarly things. But now we're talking about this story, this resurrection of Lazarus, and then Jesus saying, I'm the resurrection and life. And we say, well, yeah, that didn't happen. John made that up. It's one thing for scholars to say, yeah, maybe that's just made up. But what will this do for people sitting in the pews hearing scholars saying, well, yeah, John made that story to make a point?
Yeah, I think it's a real problem.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the reasons that I'm really grateful that I'm not a pastor or ordained person. I'm not going to pretend that I'm comfortable with that. I'm not. I'm actually really uncomfortable with it. I actually state it against my own better interest. I think it'd be absolutely fantastic if the story of Lazarus was historical. I'd love to be proved wrong about that. I just suspect that it's not.
Right.
And that's just, that's what it's like being a historian. A lot of the time, being a historian is about dealing in the mundane. And sometimes you have to say, well, I'm not a believer in, Tom Wright once talked about the story of the guys that all rise from the dead when Jesus is crucified in Matthew's gospel, and they come out of the tombs and they appear to people in Jerusalem. And Tom Wright, and I hope I'm not misquoting him, he says in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, it's one of those stories that's so strange it might just be true. You see, I don't think that's a historical criterion. There's no historical criterion of this story is so weird that I think it's true. It's just not like that, Right. We have to have quite a high bar, unfortunately, as historians. So yeah, I have no good answer to what does the person in the pew do. But I think one thing I suppose I do feel is that it is good for the person in the pew, whoever they are, to know about New Testament scholarship and to know that, these things are questioned and then maybe, to ask some of the difficult questions for themselves. Yeah. I mean, yeah, sure.
Yeah. The 500 thing, that's always been first time I read that, I thought, come on, really? If that had really happened, it would have been seen by a lot of people, obviously, all these dead people coming back to, Josephus never mentions anything like an event like that when he talks in detail about so many other things. I mean, it just seems kind of obvious that it is historical, and I agree that is a problem and it is frustrating. I don't know what you can do with it. Not much,
right?
Really, it's just the way it.
And one thing that I do feel though about reading ancient history is that, they all do this where they introduce elements of the miraculous. I mean, so we are really, really reliant on Josephus for what he tells us about the Jewish war and many other things. But Josephus says that, just before Jerusalem was destroyed, a cow gave birth to a lamb. Now, I don't think a cow gave birth to a lamb historically. I think it's pretty unlikely. But I do think that Titus did crucify a whole bunch of people in Jerusalem, So when you're doing any ancient history, you do actually, this isn't just a Gospels issue, this is an ancient history issue in general, that you get these fantastic details just thrown into stories, People will go meet a ghost in the middle of the story and it's told in exactly the same way as if you're meeting a Roman general,
And do you think that there's a sense that, like in the case of Josephus, let's say, he would know that what was it that gave birth to a
cow? It's the red heifer, actually,
right.
But yeah,
so
but
he would know that didn't happen.
Well, I don't know. You see, I mean,
or do you
that's
think you
such a
heard
good
that?
question. I don't know. See, it's one of the things I think is one of the hardest and most fun things about looking at ancient writers. Did they actually think that happened?
Right.
I mean, when it comes to gospel writers, I think they really did think that Jesus walked on the sea.
Okay.
I think they thought that,
Okay.
definitely.
Okay.
I don't think they thought I'm making this up. You know, I
Right.
think,
But
I think they
again,
thought it happened.
sorry to make the point again, but when you said you did think that they believed he walked on the water, so then I bring up that point again. Thomas saying, "Yeah, I'll kiss him on the cheek, and he's the guy we're going to handcuff." They didn't see him as extraordinary. They didn't. Like, how could you handcuff deity?
Well, and of course, that's why the gospel narratives do demand you to have this story of they couldn't see, their hearts were hardened, they were, you know. So in a way, telling the story as a kind of revelation of a secret Messiah, as a hidden Messiah, is almost a necessity of telling that story. Because otherwise, you just have a whole bunch of people that were just falling down before Jesus the whole time, you know. And that does happen. You do get some people that kneel before Jesus and fall before him, but his students keep misunderstanding, and that keeps the story rolling, you know.
Yeah, he who has ears, right? Like, you know, that.
Yeah,
that's
that's right.
common.
Yeah.
Now, there's a third general reason why I have troubles with John, and you did begin to unpack this. Maybe there's more that we can unpack, but this third category of a reason why would be the huge claims that Jesus made. We talked about John chapter 1 and the Logos. That was one of my big reasons. Number 2 was the Lazarus raising from the dead. But now these huge statements that you find in John, extraordinary claims that you just do not find in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And so only John has Jesus making theologically profound statements like, before Abraham was, I am.
I know, that's amazing.
I and the Father are one. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And we've talked about the resurrection and life, that one. Only John records John the Baptist saying, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world."
Yeah.
Only John has someone saying to Jesus, "You are my Lord and my God." I think we should talk a bit about that. So again, I have to wonder, why do Matthew, Mark, and Luke just not have these things in their accounts? Or things like it?
I mean, I think it's relatively easy to explain why Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have them. It's because John hadn't made them up yet. I mean, that's the you know. But
Okay.
I mean, the more serious answer, I suppose, would be that all of those things in some ways develop stuff you have got in the synoptic gospels. So even something like, before Abraham was, I am. So if you ask the question, does Jesus in the synoptics ever appeal to the authority of Abraham? And the answer is yes, he does. Does Jesus in the synoptics, with respect to I am the way, the truth, and the life, is Jesus ever talking about the journey that you make as a Christian as being the way? Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, go on the narrow way, the way that leads to. The whole of Luke's gospel, you could argue, it like sets things up as a kind of way of the Lord. In fact, he even calls the Christian movement the way in Acts of the Apostles. So I'm not denying the differences. Of course, those grand claims in John are grand, but they don't come out of nowhere. You know, they're not a bolt out of the blue. They do develop elements that are very much present in the synoptics. And I think, you know, going all the way back to Clement of Alexandria, you know, in the 3rd century, he said that he thought that, you know, whereas the synoptic gospels give you the sort of the bodily things, that the sort of the stuff that you can see and touch, John composed a spiritual gospel. And I think what he meant by that is, he saw John as drawing a lot of the meaning out of, you know, those synoptic elements. And it's one of the reasons people love John's gospel as well, because in some senses it gives you less work to do.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to sort of like, Mark's gospel quite likes to end a whole passage on it with a question mark. There's this great passage in Mark 8 where it ends that Jesus is having a discussion with the disciples in a boat all about the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. And the whole passage ends with Jesus saying, "Do you not yet understand?" And like, that's how Mark likes to end a passage. I think he wants the reader to go away and think, oh gosh, what's going on here? I think John's less like that. I think John wants Jesus going, I am the bread of life. So we really do understand what it means to talk about Jesus sharing bread, you know, with people. It is about Jesus. It is about Jesus being like God who gave manna in the wilderness and so on. But, you know, the synoptics are a bit more subtle than John.
It's kind of interesting because it's This is a problem with Christian writing in general. I think that Christians are not for subtlety. They want to make sure that their message so a lot of Christian literature, Christian books, especially in the evangelical world, they're terrible because they're just preaching to you. There's where great literature is subtle. Great literature draws you in, and you're part of the journey, right? Like C.S. Lewis said, don't tell people the ice cream cone was delicious. Describe it in a way that they go, wow, delicious.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that's kind of what you're saying, that, in Mark, he wants you to tease it out. He doesn't want to just, spell it all out. John is an evangelist. He's just preaching to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Although the one thing I would say, though, is that sometimes John is a more coherent narrative than Mark, because Mark does at the end leave you with loose ends, and he doesn't leave you scratching your head, including at the end of the gospel. Whereas John doesn't. John actually, he's a more tidy narrator, and author, in that he does actually want to take you on a journey.
Right.
I'd like to unpack a couple of those things that I said we only find in John, maybe get some new information. One in particular, so it's only in John where you have Thomas saying, "You are my Lord and God." And a lot of Christians will say, there you go, Jesus is deity, that sort of thing. What did Thomas mean when he said, "You are my Lord and God"?
I mean, it's a difficult one. I mean, some people have seen it as being almost like a kind of political statement, so that Thomas is attributing to Jesus what Caesars wanted, people to acknowledge, that they were a Lord and God. But I think at its root, you're going back to one of the most fundamental ways of talking about God from the Hebrew Bible, that he is Lord and God. I mean, those terms, come repeatedly. And I mean,
but in those other passages that you just referred to in the Old Testament, there's that definite article, "I am the God," the God, not just one of them.
Yeah.
Okay, whereas Thomas he doesn't use that definite article. He says, "You're like a God." And this is where Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus says, "I am a God, one of the gods."
What I think is so clever about that story is that you go from the individual to the global. So he actually has Jesus as my Lord and my God. So intensely personal response, as personal as you can get. My Lord and my God. And and lots of people could go, okay, well, that's Thomas's God. But then you go straight to that passage we were talking about earlier on, about how Jesus is Messiah and Son of God, and that's something for everybody. So you do go from the most personalized statement, confession of faith, to a statement of Jesus's identity for all of his believers. So yeah, I think it's kind of clever.
It's interesting. You see that in John as well, in the raising of Lazarus, where you see these situations in John where something happens, but the understanding of that happening can be very different depending on who's watching. So Lazarus, Mary, and so they're thrilled, and this is a demonstration that Jesus is resurrected. But the Pharisees that see it, they determine they got to kill this guy. Right?
Yeah.
So, they're both seeing the same thing, right? But
and it's where John works so well as drama. I mean, I have a chapter in the book about how John works as drama. And one of the things that I think makes John so compelling, one of the reasons why the Jesus films often adapt the Johannine versions of stories, is because he's very good at drawing three-dimensional characters. So a lot of the synoptic characters are a bit wooden. We don't really, do we get to find out anything about that paralyzed man in Mark 2? He doesn't even speak. Or look at Luke's version of Mary and Martha. It's a really short story, and in that story, Mary doesn't speak at all. And then you get to John 11 and 12, and the speaking parts for both Mary and Martha. And Mary, and even Martha now becomes a positive character that knows who Jesus is. So there's a real skill in John's gospel in all the different reactions, even to the point where you have this ambiguous character, Nicodemus. Does he believe or not? And you get to John 19, where he's burying Jesus. We still don't really know if he's come to a full faith or not. Joseph of Arimathea has. He's said to be a disciple, albeit a secret one, but has Nicodemus? We don't know. So I think it's one of the reasons why people go back to John's gospel, is it does have this very clever, dramatic way of telling the Jesus story.
Okay, maybe if we could take a couple steps back and maybe a little bit of a right turn here. We've been talking about the role of the human in the writing of these Gospels. We've talked about, authors borrowing from each other, knowing of each other, building on each other's work. We talked about John making things up. So very much the human element. Could we talk a little bit about the divine element? People talk about divine inspiration of the Gospels. What does that mean? How does it work? What does it look like?
I mean, the easiest answer for me is to punt on the question and say that as someone that works in a humanities department in a university, we're interested in religion and how it works as a kind of human project. And that doesn't mean that we're against religion. It doesn't mean we're against Christians or Jews or Muslims or anybody else, but we are trying to explain the human dimensions of this fascinating religious tradition that we're looking at. So that's probably the easiest way that I could tell the story. But I think it's important, when you're looking at any of these materials, to remember that these materials are really, really sacred and important for many, many Christians all over the world. And one of the reasons that I will always try and be as careful as I can in the way that I talk about them is that I know that these are texts that people hold very, very dearly, and they hold them dearly because they see them as divine. They see them as divine products and not the products of human beings. So, I mean, I sometimes get into this when I teach my intro New Testament class, and sometimes, students will push back and say, well, hold on a minute, shouldn't we be looking at the divine element of these texts? And I say, well, do you know what? Christianity is and has always been an incarnational religion. It's a religion about how God became a human being. So at the heart of the religion is studying a human being that many people see God as coming through. So for me, the human element, even when you're talking about the divine, is significant when you're looking at Jesus, because Jesus in Christian belief is God made human being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there are so many more questions I have. We've covered a quarter of what I wanted to do, but we really need to draw a line under this. Mark, were there anything that we did not talk about that you'd like to make sure we get on this subject or on the book that you've written?
No, remember that at the end of John's Gospel, the author suddenly becomes really conscious of all the stuff that he hasn't written. And he says, I suppose if everything was written, the whole world wouldn't be able to contain all the books. And, to me, the best kind of conversations are those that bring up more questions than they answer, because they carry on, helping us to think about the issues in exciting ways. So I appreciate the conversation very much.
Okay. Do you have other projects in the works?
Yeah, I wrote a book on the Gospel of Thomas a few years ago, but I'm doing another book on the Gospel of Thomas that touches on some of the other aspects of Thomas that I didn't touch on before. So I'm enjoying that at the moment.
Okay. And we didn't talk about your YouTube channel. You've been doing blogging for a long, long time, and then you started doing some YouTube.
Trying to, yeah. It's fun. It's different. And frankly, talking's easier than writing. So it's a little bit self-indulgent, and because I recently finished this book on John and writing is difficult, I thought, let's just spend a little bit more time talking instead. And it reaches more people as well, and they don't have to spend any money, or at least not much money, hopefully, on accessing it.
Right. Well, we'll have links in the show notes for your YouTube channel and your faculty page. Thanks. And of course, we want to put another shout out for this book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, John's Knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, published late last year, I think it was, by Ears Publishing.
Yeah. It was, yeah.
Yeah, I'm about a third of the way through it and just thoroughly enjoying it. So I recommend it to
thank you.
Any of our listeners. I read Robin Faith Walsh's book, and now I'm about a third through yours, so I'm getting a bit of a dose of textual criticism, I guess. And
great.
It's fascinating stuff. Like it is like a puzzle, and you're trying to put the pieces together. Yeah.
Which reminds me, we talked to her last week, and she said she had been talking to you, Mark, about Paul and his influence on the Gospels, and she says you need to write that book.
I've been pushing back against her on some of that stuff.
Okay.
But she's a good scholar. She's a really fine scholar, and she's always interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Mark. We really appreciate this.
Great pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cheers.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com or leave them at our YouTube channel. Same name, same logo. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.